In the north, if you said you were a South Indian, they would say, "Oh, aap Madrasi ho." That you're a Madrasi. Not every South Indian is a Madrasi.
A lot of things I think I have learned about India after coming to Canada. I didn't know for the longest time that people in the South don't speak Hindi.
US immigration policy has not been updated in the last 33 years. Imagine what the world was 30 years back. Smoking on flights was acceptable 30 years back. That's the era we're talking about here. I was walking from a metro station to meet somebody at a restaurant, and on the way, I must have heard at least four or five different languages on the short walk, and that was really exciting for me. Who are not immigrants don't understand that you have to have solid ground under your feet with regard to your legal status to make any decision in life. Everybody is a product of where they have been raised and the context in which they've been raised. If you really want to create some kind of change, attacking their way of life is not going to get you very far.
Embarking on the immigration journey often feels like navigating uncharted waters, each border crossing a unique tale of anticipation and belonging. As I reminisce about my past as a national student, the memories of long queues and interrogative glances resurface. To the point, once returning from India, I remember an officer asked me, "Do you know the metro station near our college?" Oof, that was a tough one. Obviously, I knew the metro station, but in that moment, you don't expect such questions. But then I understood in that moment that expect the unexpected. However, the narrative shifted, mirroring the transformation from an anxious immigrant to a welcomed permanent resident of Canada. The border became a smoother passage, akin to scanning a passport and presenting the PR card, meeting with a warm welcome home. It's a sentiment etched in the immigrant experience, a transition from fear to familiarity. This relatable immigration anxiety found a voice through our guest's journey, where once returning to Toronto, a question escaped into the air: will they ask me where I work? A reflex that was born from the conditioning of previous immigration encounters. Through her lens, we explored the intricate dance between anxiety and assurance. The script flipped from apprehension to warmth. The vulnerability of questioning one's place contrasts with the reassurance found in those two simple words, welcome home. It's a tale that encapsulates the broader immigrant experience, where the border is not just a physical line, but a threshold of emotions, fears, and eventual triumphs. The journey is not merely about physical relocation, it's a metamorphosis of the soul. It's navigating through uncertainty, embracing the unknown, and ultimately finding a sense of belonging. In sharing her experience, our guest contributes to the collective narrative of those who, like her, have transformed the fearsome immigration journey into a heartfelt welcome. Please welcome Sindhu Mahadevan.
It's lovely to be here, Gurashish.
Welcome, Sindhu. Welcome to the podcast. Very excited for this conversation.
Me too. I've been looking forward to this.
Okay, so in my season two, I have decided to turn up the fun factor a little bit. So I'm gonna start with a little bit some fun questions. Okay, so ready?
Uh huh.
Okay,
Yes, absolutely.
okay. So my first question is, what's your go-to breakfast?
My go to breakfast.
Yeah.
It depends on how much time I have. If I don't have a lot of time, it is methi thepla, which is
Okay.
methi ka paratha, which
Hmm.
is pre made, just to be
Okay.
clear.
So is it like something you eat on a regular basis?
I do. I do. It's pretty much every couple of weeks. Yeah, that's my breakfast.
Okay, interesting. And with tea,
Yeah.
coffee, what is it? Are you a tea person, coffee person?
I am a tea person, but coffee is quicker, easier, more conducive to work, I
Hmm.
think. I like to joke, that tea is for friends and then coffee is for work,
I
you know.
agree. Yeah.
So, yeah, depending on the use case, I guess.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. So next is share a favorite song or a dialogue or a movie and tell us why it's significant to you.
Oh my. I'm really bad at these movie song questions. I don't watch that many movies.
Hmm.
Uh, I'm much more of a like documentary, docu-series kind of person. So nothing's really coming up to mind right now. I'm drawing a blank.
Okay. If not, tell us about a quote that resonates with you a lot, and why is that?
This one, we walked into a restaurant, my husband and I, in Wisconsin. And I don't even know who this quote is by, but it was on the wall and it said, "In making a living,
Hmm.
don't forget to make a life."
Ooh, yes. I
And
love that.
it just sat with me. I saw it maybe just once or twice over the course of that evening, and it has never left me, you know,
Mm,
because growing up in India, with that middle class values, we
yeah,
are taught the value of everything. But I think sometimes you can lose sight of the bigger picture, you know?
absolutely. Yeah. I love that. That's very interesting. Okay.
It is.
So if you had to teach us like one phrase in your mother tongue, what would it be and what does it mean?
There's a idiom
Okay.
that says whether the banana tree falls on the fence or the fence falls on the banana tree, ultimately
Okay.
the banana tree is the one that's injured.
Yeah.
So the idea behind that is if you are vulnerable, it doesn't matter what the situation is, you're the one that's
Mm,
going to get hurt,
yes.
right? And I think there's a lot of profoundness behind some of these seemingly village sayings, right?
Yeah.
My father was just full of these village sayings. He was born and raised in a village, and a lot of what he said, I didn't understand it at the time, but I think they hold a lot of wisdom beyond just the superficial nature of
Mhm.
what they sound.
Yeah. And how do you say that in your mother tongue?
Uh, വേലി വാഴയില വീണാലും വാഴ വേലിയില വീണാലും വാഴയ്ക്ക. I cannot get the word for hurt, but it's like
Okay.
it is the banana tree that gets hurt.
Okay, okay. I'm not gonna try to repeat that. I'm not gonna butcher it.
No, I'm barely getting it right.
Okay. Okay, perfect. So now, lastly, if you could teleport to a particular place from your home country or maybe the places you have lived, which one would it be and what would you do?
It would have to be UT Dallas, which is where I did my master's as an international student.
Hmm.
I had some of my best days at UT Dallas. It
Hmm.
was a clueless me hanging around with a bunch of equally clueless international students, and we had a whale of a time.
Okay.
Nobody really understood what they were doing, especially in their first year, other than going through schoolwork. It was so much discovery. We had some truly hilarious experiences,
Hmm.
and it was just a very supportive set of friends, a very new novel environment, and
Yeah.
we were just young enough to be more excited than terrified. There comes an age where too much novelty is just scary.
Hmm.
you know I
Yeah.
think we were at that right age where we were more excited than scared.
Okay. I'll get back to that. We'll circle back on that. Before that, I want to take you back to the time you spent in India. So tell us a little bit about your formative years and how was it like just growing up there?
I was brought up in Ahmedabad, and my schooling and early life was all in Ahmedabad. Part 2.0 was in Coimbatore, where I went for my undergrad, for my
Okay.
bachelor's degree in biotechnology. So I'll split the story into two.
Sure.
I am ethnically South Indian. I was raised in Ahmedabad. At that time, I didn't think of this in sort of immigration terms, but now I do.
Hmm.
So being in Ahmedabad was very interesting. I was fluent in Hindi, and outside of my home, I was leading the typical kid life. But inside of my home, we were a very culturally South Indian family. So
Hmm.
in hindsight, I think there was a lot of code switching going on. You try to fit in your school years with the Hindi speaking crowd, with
Hmm.
that culture, with that understanding, with whatever social aesthetic or is popular at the time, right? But when
Mhm.
you come back home, there are very different values, very different understanding of the surroundings that you're living in. So that was most of my time in Ahmedabad. I remember it to be a happy, fun childhood for the most part. Of course, there's this struggle of fitting in as a
Mhm.
South Indian, right? And I realized quite early, although I didn't have the vocabulary to say it, that
Mhm.
people don't have a very strong understanding of people who are not like them,
Hmm.
right? South Indians were viewed as people who just ate idli sambar, and that was it. It's like, well,
Just
there's
like a generic view, right?
and it stops there. This it doesn't go beyond that. So that's probably the thing that has led me to investigate the immigrant experience so much, is
Mhm.
because there's so much depth to these experiences, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
uh, Experience 2.0 in India was going to Coimbatore. This was like somewhat of a homecoming,
Mhm.
because I am an ethnic Tamil speaker. So when I went to Coimbatore to do my undergrad, I was really shocked at the sheer culture shift.
Mhm.
Within Coimbatore, I went to a very conservative college campus.
Mhm.
Um, the girls were not allowed outside of the college hostel, not even campus,
Okay.
outside after 6 o'clock. And coming from Ahmedabad, which is a fairly liberal
Yeah.
city, for women and stuff, I was really shocked at all of these rules. We had dress codes, we had to wear salwar kameezes,
Mhm.
and it was just a whole other world, right? I was just surrounded by a very different way of
Hmm.
living. And there was some adjustment. I think it was not easy initially, the first year. But then I'm also, in hindsight, very grateful for that experience, because I think it opens you up to the idea that you don't have all the answers in the world.
Yeah.
you know Other people have very different ways of living the good life. And yeah, your formula will not apply to everybody, and I'm very glad I learned that lesson early, although it was painful initially.
Talk a little bit more about that. What do you mean by that? Like, what formula? What if you can give us like an example of something?
So when I went in, I think I managed to alienate a few people, saying, as youngsters do in their own sort of
Hmm.
brash way, that you guys are so conservative, like you've no idea. Ahmedabad was like that, and it was so cool, and I had, so much freedom. And what is this jail
Yeah.
life we are living now?
Hmm.
And um, I have always been somebody that has not been very shy about airing my views, especially among my own peers.
Okay.
And surprisingly, that didn't win me a lot of, acceptance. Um, and I think gradually I realized that everybody is a product of where they have been raised, and the context in which they've been raised.
Hmm.
And if you really want to create some kind of change, attacking their way of life is not going to get you very far.
Absolutely.
you know Maybe talking to them, maybe trying to meet them halfway, maybe seeing where you and them have more in common, is probably going to get you farther. And almost always there's more in common than there is difference
Yeah.
you know
And when you said that you are very vocal in terms of putting your opinions out, like, is there a time or maybe some situation where that might have put you in trouble?
I think people uh, misunderstood where that was coming from.
Okay.
I think it's perceived as arrogance sometimes,
Hmm.
especially when you're younger. When you're
Hmm.
older, it's different. When you're older, I think people understand a little more the legitimacy of your opinions, that it's rooted in experience and things like that.
And I think also when you grow up, your vocabulary also changes and you understand and you learn a better way of conveying your thoughts rather than being completely blunt. And I think I can relate to that because I was sort of the similar person. Yeah.
I don't think bluntness was the problem,
Hmm.
but I think I was trying to convince them with the assumption that I was right and they were wrong.
Okay. Hmm.
That they were the ones that needed to be uh, educated, taught, told that there was a better way, right? It never occurs to younger people that maybe there's this is a two-way street. That is something
Hmm.
you learn, I think, later on.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
bluntness was not the problem. I think I've been a fairly sensitive person overall.
Mhm.
But where that's misunderstood is that I think young people in the Indian context, it takes a while before you can earn the right to have strong opinions.
Hmm.
Right? There's a
Yeah.
what have you accomplished in life for you to
Mhm.
think that you can have such strong opinions? You know,
Yeah, yeah,
once you have a job, once you have a few accomplishments behind your name, then you can have your opinions. Not as a
yeah.
college student who has not even a single alphabet behind her name, you know.
Yeah, it's like, how the quote, I think that can apply here also. It says that don't talk about money if you have literally $0 in the account. You're not the right person to talk about it. So I think this applies here as well. Yeah.
I think so. So I think there's some of that misunderstanding sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. And is there something that people might not know about South India? Like you mentioned, people have like a very limited understanding of the culture that people might not know that you would like to share.
I think what they don't realize is that the South is a very diverse place.
Mhm.
There are four major states, but there are also way more languages than Tamil, Malayalam, Telugu, and Kannada.
Mhm.
There is also Tulu. There's also all these regional variations of languages. And within these big states of Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, even Kerala, there's all these sub varieties of people that have very different cultural understandings, very different just ways of life.
Mhm.
And I think they tend to look at the South as a monolithic block. You
Mhm.
know, language sometimes is a uh, great indicator of thought. You know,
Yeah.
so for example, in the North, uh, if you said you were a South Indian, they would say, "Oh, aap Madrasi ho." You know that you're a Madrasi. Not every South Indian is a Madrasi, right?
Yeah.
So I think that diminishing of the sheer variability in the South is something that happens a lot in the North. And that's
Hmm.
something I would like people to appreciate.
Okay. I think it sort of happens from the north also, right? Since both of us are talking about this, I think we have those stereotypes within India also about the northern people that everybody is non-vegetarian and bhangra and all those certain things. Whereas
Yeah.
majority of the people in the north actually are vegetarian. If you see that, the actual demographics and actual percentage of people who, who eat non-vegetarian or not. So I think that's something, I think that's why I think we're having these conversations to break those molds, not like being an immigrant, but even like within the same country. There are a lot of things I think I have learned about India after coming to Canada, just because I was able to meet with people just like yourself and many other people from the South. And I had no idea about their cultures, or even I didn't know for the longest time that people in the South don't speak Hindi. I swear I didn't know about that. I got to know after
Mhm.
interacting and being friends with few people I met here in Canada. Yeah.
Yeah, you are not the only person I've heard say this, that they actually learned more about India after coming to the
Mm.
US or to Canada, because I think their
Yeah.
just their cohort of people expanded. It just exploded,
Absolutely.
really.
Yeah.
People suddenly all over India they were interacting with, and that really changed how they saw their own country, which is
Absolutely.
beautiful.
Oh, it's amazing. It's probably the best use of being in a diverse place like Canada you can make of. It's like not limited to people from other parts of the country. Even like what your own country, meeting these people, having these conversations, you just learn so much. And I think that's the such a beautiful thing about being in Canada for sure. Yeah.
It is.
Okay, so now let's just pivot towards your career choice. Tell me, why did you get into this career, or was at any point a pressure of getting into a certain career from your family? Was that a part of the conversation?
I'm one of the few, lucky people in India and from our culture that can say that I didn't have a lot of pressure in choosing my career. I was free to study what I wanted. The only thing that really constrained what I could study, I think, was that we don't really have exposure to a lot of what we can
Mhm.
do, right?
Mhm.
There are these few things that are laid out to us in popular conversation, popular culture, and all of
Mhm.
that as potential careers. And among them, the thing that I was interested in was biology. And I wanted to study something related with biology.
Mhm.
I briefly considered the idea of doing something related with writing. As you know, I really enjoy writing.
Yeah.
And the only thing I could think of was journalism or law. And the only law I knew of was people in court, right? I
Mm.
didn't know that there was such a thing as constitutional law, where you
Mhm.
are thinking about like constitutionality and things like that. Or I didn't know about public policy that has a lot of these
Mhm.
aspects. So, to that extent, the bouquet was small. I really enjoy biology, I still do. So I decided to do my undergrad in biotech engineering.
Okay.
So I chose to study that in Coimbatore, and that was my undergrad. For masters, I carried on along the same lines. I did my masters in molecular and cell biology at UT Dallas. That would have translated into generally translates into a research type career,
Mhm.
whether in academia or industry, that doesn't matter. But I sort of fell out of love with that, given the realities of what I saw in lab life and the fact that it's a very difficult path for immigrants.
Mhm.
The compensation is not great. It's a difficult life, even on a good day. And getting visa sponsorship is very, very difficult.
Mhm.
Um, and lab life was starting to feel very, yeah, I kind of fell out of love and I wanted to be involved in a little more sort of practical, I want to see the results now sort of industry. And that's how I found quality assurance. And
Mhm.
now that's still the career that I'm in. I am a quality assurance professional in the medical device industry.
Mhm. Okay. And since you briefly mentioned about your time in US and studying in UT, your masters in molecular and cell biology, tell me, like I believe it was in 2012 when you decided to move there. But what influenced the decision to go there, and why not any other country?
I actually did consider other countries.
Mm.
I considered Singapore,
Okay.
primarily because of its proximity to India, and
Hmm.
the quality of their education is also really good. They have some very good life sciences degrees. The reason I didn't pursue Singapore was that the admit that they were willing to give me was for PhD. And I
Hmm.
was not sure that I wanted to do PhD right after my undergrad. That was a leap too far for me at that point. And in hindsight, I'm glad I didn't make it because clearly I'm not cut out for research, as I have discovered since.
Okay.
The other option was the US. And there, I think I can admit now that it wasn't any kind of data driven decision. I think
Hmm.
it was more the illusion of familiarity.
Okay.
You hear about the US so much as a 90s kid, in pop culture, somebody's aunt, so and so cousin.
Hmm.
There were members of my own extended family there. So it just feels like it should be accessible for you too. You can make a life there because of the social proof that so many others have also made a
Already been
life
there.
there.
Yeah. Hmm.
I personally didn't know anybody in the UK. I had heard that it's hard to get jobs there.
Hmm.
Australia, I had heard some stuff about, with regard to, I think right at that time, there were a few reports of racism in Australia. So I think that basically disqualified it for me.
Mm.
So that's sort of how I landed on the US. But to say that it was some extensive data driven decision, I think would be just not true.
Okay. So, on the podcast, we have discovered a lot about the international student life of being in Canada. And I want to tell us about the life of a national student in the US. And you briefly was talking earlier also, and you also called that you were just clueless initially, you and your peers. So talk a little bit more about that and the life in even like in Texas. How was that like?
So, coming to the US as an international student, it's a very orderly experience. It's
Hmm.
step one, step two, step three. I'm sure that's very similar to
Hmm.
your experience as an international student in Canada. What that does is that it leads you to believe that the rest of immigration will also be like that. It's
Hmm.
not that anybody says that, but you logically extrapolate that the rest of immigration will be like that.
Hmm.
So we came to the US, and by we, I mean myself and my cohort
Hmm.
of friends. Um, when I came to the US, I was quite diligent. I did a lot of research on jobs and internships and expense and all of that. The reason I chose Texas is that I didn't want to spend a lot of money on
Hmm.
living expenses. And places like Boston and California can be very expensive for
Absolutely.
students
Yeah.
to live at. So I chose Texas. Life in Texas, um, well, I was in Dallas. Dallas is not the same as Texas
Hmm.
because it's a fairly diverse place. I have never felt unwelcome or strange in Dallas at all. UTD was a nice campus. It's not the greatest of all time, but it was a perfectly welcoming campus. I don't think
Hmm.
I have any complaints. There, the life sciences course and programming, not the best. It's not what UTD is known for, but I had a great experience. I learned a lot, both inside of the classroom and outside. I think the cluelessness part of it emerges because every immigrant, I think, starts from scratch with regard to the job hunt and
Yeah.
the internship hunting and all of that. And I think we don't realize just how uphill that is, with no connections, without an understanding of just how tilted the playing field is because of sponsorship reasons,
Yeah.
particularly in the US. And
Hmm.
we are sort of, the student experience primes you to believe that the rest of US experience is also going to be very orderly and smooth. You get your H1, then you file for a green card, and then you get the green card, and then you live
Hmm.
happily ever after.
Hmm.
And yeah, that's not at all how it works. And gradually, those walls start to crumble one after another, and it's a
Hmm.
very distressing experience. There's just no other way to put it.
Yeah. And you know how we are like allowed here to work 20 hours a week as a student? Is that the same case in the US? How does that work?
No. You are allowed to work part time, but only on campus.
Hmm.
And a narrow exception to that is that you're allowed to have internships, but only if they are related strictly to your degree. There
Hmm.
are no off campus jobs allowed outside of campus. I should add that not everybody will agree with me when I say that the journey is, nobody will say it's easy. No
Of course.
immigrant in the
Yeah.
US will say it's easy. But there's a narrow slice that managed to make it to EB1, which is an exceptional category. It used to be that if you were in that exceptional category, that's sort of a fast track to a green card. It is not easy to get there, but there are people who go through that route, who have a better time of it.
Hmm.
But yeah, US immigration is not an easy system,
Yeah.
not at all.
Yeah. I know how you have said in one of your articles, like, there are some indisputable, immemorial facts in our world that chocolate is nice, puppies are awesome, and US immigration is a raging dumpster fire.
US immigration policy has not been updated in the last 33 years, close to it, 3 decades. In this time, the number of work visas has remained constant, the number of green cards has remained constant.
Hmm.
Meanwhile, the economy has grown tremendously. The population proportionately of immigrants coming in has grown. Everything has grown. Imagine what the world was 30 years back, right? Smoking on flights was acceptable 30 years back. That's the era we're talking about here.
Oh, really? I didn't know
So,
that. Okay.
In the US, smoking in flights was acceptable 30 years back.
Wow.
So that's how out of touch US immigration policy is with today. We have
Mm.
come to a point in the US where people who came as immigrants on the most common category of the green card,
Mm-hmm.
they filed. Their children were dependents with them and they filed.
Mm-hmm.
Their children outgrew that dependent status
Yeah.
and they are now risking being undocumented in that country. That is
Mm.
how bad things have gotten.
Wow. Yeah.
That's why the view I expressed there is hardly, unique. A lot of people will agree with me here. The wait times for the most common channel of getting to permanent residency now exceeds the productive life of human beings for Indian nationals.
Mm. Yeah, like you also mentioned that it's like living on like a borrowed time. You don't really know when you'll be asked to just go back.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's pretty much what it is, because unlike the Canadian work permit, if you lose your job in 60 days, you're you either find a new job and transfer your work permit or
Hmm.
you're out,
Wow, that's like a scary situation to be in for sure. Yeah.
especially your whole life.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
Mhm.
Now, so Sidhu, I would like to get into your decision to move to Canada. I think you applied
Mhm.
for PR in March 2020, and then you have said you were left in living. You will. It was like you were living in a limbo because
Mhm.
pandemic made things really, really, really hard.
Yeah, it really
But then
did.
eventually in September something happened. But tell us about that 1 year. Like you said, like living on a borrowed time and everything was complicated. You don't know when you'll be kicked out. So how was that 1 year of waiting for the PR like?
We applied in March 2020, right before the declaration of the pandemic.
Mhm.
So, timing wise, it really couldn't have been much worse than that.
Yeah.
Um, we applied in March of 2020, and all things said, we got our visa in hand sometime around late September, early October. I
Mhm.
think was the timeline that we got the visa in hand to come to Canada, 2021. So it was a year and a half where we heard basically nothing. And the
Mhm.
expectation at that time was still 6 months. That's what the website
Mhm.
showed. They'd probably not updated it.
Yeah.
So between March and September of 2020, we expected that even with some delay, maybe it's 9 months, maybe it's a year. It was really after March 2021 that we started to get really concerned,
Mhm.
because at this point there was some vaccines being given out, there was some limited travel being eased, there was some restrictions starting to be reconsidered
Yeah.
across the board, and yet our application was just not moving, and I was unable to work at this time. So
Mhm.
my I had not been able to work since 2018, actually, in the
Mhm.
US. So, while my husband was able to work, I was the one that was really, really anxious to get out and get my life started. It was truly limbo, because
Mhm.
at some point we were going to have to think about what to do if Canada didn't come through, because you
Mhm.
can't just endlessly wait, right?
Yeah.
You have to decide what to do in the US. Should we go ahead and get a work visa? Should we continue our stay here?
Mhm.
Should we just abandon everything and leave? Should we
Yeah.
go to Canada? It was just a time where you were in stasis. You couldn't take any decision, right?
Mhm.
And that's why I describe the word limbo, because I think people who are not immigrants don't understand that you have to have solid ground under your feet with regard to
Yeah.
just your legal status to make any decision in life, right? If you
Absolutely.
don't know where you're going to be 6 months from now, how do you take any decisions, right,
Mhm.
of growth in life?
Yeah.
That's the thing that made it very difficult.
Yeah. When you said that, I think it reminds me of this brief conversation we had, like how we have to really be like 3 steps ahead. Like, what are you going to do next within your immigration process? And I think it reminds me again of my time, when my work permit was expiring. I had like 2 months left, and I was just trying to get some ray of hope, something happens. But I think obviously pandemic was also the added pressure, Sindhu, I think, which made things really, really hard. And there were times, like you said, no update details were mentioned on the website. You don't know when you're gonna listen to the next response. So I think I'm sure that limbo is probably the best word to describe that time. Yeah.
You know, the interesting thing is when you're outside of Canada, you also don't have easy access to that number that you can call. Although the wait times on those numbers are pretty crazy, that IRCC has,
Yeah.
that the hotline that you can call,
Hmm.
you don't have access to that.
Hmm.
So we had to create a Canadian number using this service because we didn't have a Canadian number, right? You can only call using a Canadian number.
Yeah.
And we would wake up like everybody else early in the morning, get on the line. 90% of the times it would never lead to anyone and it would just get cut. It
Hmm.
was it's the lack of information, honestly,
Yeah.
that causes that problem.
Hmm.
If they could have just had some kind of estimate and updates, it would have made life a lot better for a lot of people
Yeah.
at that time.
And I'm sure like there are a lot of people, we say like my acquaintances, who are still awaiting for their PR since like 2021, who applied with
Yes.
me. And by God's grace I got it like in couple of months, but they are still awaiting, and there is no estimate time that when they're going to get a response from them.
Yes. IRCC has suffered from long wait times ever since the pandemic. And um, the pandemic is just not a good enough excuse anymore. They have
Yeah.
millions of cases in the backlog still.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they've really suffered, and doesn't seem to be getting better. That's
Mhm.
where the focus should be of resources.
Yeah. Okay. And then finally, but you finally came in October 2021 to Canada. So tell us about your first day and what were the initial thoughts and emotions when you landed?
Gurashish, I will never forget
Mhm.
in my whole life the day I left the US and I came to Canada,
Hmm.
especially because we drove across the border. We didn't fly. I remember when I took up a job at Medtronic, which was in Minnesota. Somebody told me that before 9/11, they could go to Canada, drive across the border with just their US driver's license.
Hmm.
And that just blew my mind, because in
Yeah.
our world, in your world and my world, borders are these very hostile places where if you go there, somebody will blow your brains out, you
Yeah.
know and the idea that you could just drive across a border and it was just so easy. It was something that I put on my bucket list that day, that one day I will drive across the US Canada border just to see what it is like.
Yeah.
And I don't know, they say in Hindi that किस मनहूस घड़ी में मैंने वो कहा था, in what terrible
Yeah.
hour I made that wish. That dream came true with me leaving the US.
Okay.
uh, we drove across the border. It was on the Blue Water Bridge connecting Sarnia to Port Huron.
Hmm.
um, and as we drove across, it was immense joy
Hmm.
and total, like, real sadness at
Hmm.
everything that had happened.
Hmm.
Why did it have to be so difficult? It was not sadness that I was not able to build a life in the US. I was okay with that. I still am.
Hmm.
It's fine.
Yeah.
But why did that journey have to be so arduous? You know,
Yeah.
if I was to come to Canada, why couldn't it have happened earlier?
Yeah.
With less heartache, with not this whole pandemic related complexity in between,
Hmm.
with not being able to work for 3 years. It was just so
Hmm.
much piled on, right?
Yeah.
So we came to the Blue Water Bridge. We pulled up to. I pulled up. My husband was driving the other, like the truck, the
Okay.
U-Haul truck, and I pull up to the person who checks your paperwork and everything. And because we presented our landing documents as permanent resident, they were so welcoming. And that was just not processing for me. It's like, why are they being so nice? It just doesn't make sense. I was used to skepticism, a little bit of hostility. I was not used to this kind of thing.
Mhm,
And she gave me back my papers, and I let out a sigh,
mhm.
just of relief.
Yeah.
And she asked me something like, "Are you okay?" Or she said something like, "You'll be fine. Don't worry."
Hmm.
And I was really surprised at that level of, just human to human
Warmth.
connection between a border officer and an immigrant. I was not used to that.
Yeah. Okay. Isn't that a Canadian thing to be that warm? No.
I I've heard it both ways.
Okay.
Border officers are, I mean, they're there for a reason, right? They're there to,
Of
catch
course.
things
Yeah.
that shouldn't be going across. So I can imagine being a little bit uh, jaded is kind of part of their job. But
Yeah.
in that moment, it was just really genuine, and I was not expecting that. I really wasn't.
Okay.
Very memorable. I will never forget that experience.
I'm sure about that. I think that's a great segue to another quote from your article. You said that I went from living in a country with which I had forged a relationship but resisted accepting me to a country that I wasn't emotionally connected to but had already accepted me. Talk a little bit more about that.
I think the strangest thing to me about Canada was when I received the permanent resident documents. I had never visited Canada ever.
Hmm.
So there was a little disconnect between the complete opposite idea that I had lived in the US for 9 years. I have really understood many aspects of the US politically, historically,
Mhm.
immigration wise, the
Mhm.
people there, just what makes the country tick,
Yeah.
sort of like India. And the system had refused to accept or give a sense of belonging
Hmm.
to me, right?
Yeah.
And here I was coming into a country with which I had no relationship, no connection, no
Mhm.
emotional understanding of its people, its culture, its baggage, its you know history.
Yeah.
And I was already a permanent resident here. I
Hmm.
belonged here, and to me it was like, what does that mean? What does it mean to belong to a place you don't know?
Hmm. Yeah.
It's so interesting, isn't it, that these
Yeah.
pieces of paper that convey belonging and what belonging actually means are two completely different things.
Yeah. I think it's also because you were just done with consistent paperwork, back and forth, the conversations and the complications and the requirements and this updating your status each time. You were just done, and then coming to the point where a card defines that you are a permanent resident in Canada and don't have to do anything else for another 5 years minimum. So I think maybe that's why you felt a little bit more belonged way before you even reached here.
Potentially, I think it was a identity and feeling wise sort of confusing.
Mhm.
It was that I have stability now, right?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
now I can do the hard work of building my connections, my understanding, my awareness of what Canada is as a country. How can I contribute? How can I
Mhm.
figure out what the country is about?
Mhm.
It's hard to do that when you don't have the solidity of
Hmm.
legal status,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
It's hard to do that. If you have to keep fighting for that, how do you build that sense of belonging?
Yeah. And would you say that's also the reason you end up doing that ritual that you have, which you, despite living in the US for like almost a decade, living in multiple houses, you never did that ritual? Please share with the listeners what the ritual is and what does it signifies.
It's amazing how many things strike you only in hindsight. It's almost silly,
Yeah.
When we moved to Canada, we took up residence in a rental apartment.
Mhm.
It was probably the fifth, eighth, seventh rental apartment that I had lived in my life. But when we
Mhm.
came to Canada, we did a small housewarming ceremony that we do in our culture. I say our because it's me and my husband.
Mm-hmm.
You put a small container of milk
Mm-hmm.
and you boil it, and the boiling of the milk is considered symbolic of prosperity,
Mm.
and that's the way you usher in prosperity into your new home.
Okay.
It is so simple. There's nothing a whole lot involved in that. And yet, I never did it in any of the other rental homes that I had lived in the US. It just
Mm-hmm.
never occurred to me. I never felt like doing it, and I never did it. And in Canada, it's not like it was our own place, and I did do it.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until much later that I contemplated why that was
Mm-hmm.
the case. It's
Yeah.
because I felt finally that this is a place where I can live on my own terms.
Mm. Yeah.
That's the power of um, just having that solid legal foundation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I believe you with that boiled milk, you had to make something to eat or drink. How does that work?
Yeah, so you boil the milk, and using that boiled milk, you consume some beverage made with that milk to sort
Okay.
of share in that blessing. You either make
Mm.
tea or coffee or some beverage out of that,
Yeah.
and you share it with yourself and whoever else is present. So if somebody else has decided to join your housewarming, you share with
Mm.
them as well. It's a really beautiful, really
Yeah.
small
Yeah.
ceremony, but yeah, there's a lot of beauty in it.
Yeah, absolutely. The beauty is always in these tiny things. I love that. Thank you for sharing with us. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Sindhu, now someone who has lived in, two North American countries, tell us like what difference in the culture you have noticed. That's something that people might not know. That's something that struck you a lot. That, oh my God, this is how Canada is. This was nothing close to what we experienced in the US, or the vice versa. Anything.
There's lots of things I think in Canada that I wasn't really prepared for, or that I didn't know of. One thing I didn't know of is Canada's wholesale embrace
Hmm.
of multilingualism. And
Hmm.
I don't just mean French and English, I really do mean multilingualism.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Just the other day, I was walking from a metro station to meet somebody at a restaurant, and on the way, um, I must have heard at least 4 or 5 different languages on the short walk from the metro station to that restaurant. And that was really exciting for me, that we have a city that I live in, Toronto, that is so thriving, and that you're encouraged to speak different languages on the streets. People seem to do it without any concern for being called out, or
Yeah.
that they're concerned about, kind of signaling themselves as being others,
Mhm.
not from here. That concern of being othered is very real for immigrants.
Hmm.
That is something that is truly delightful, just delightful about Canada, I have to say. The other things I noticed about Canada is that I think the understanding of what it means to be a well fitting immigrant in Canada is different.
Mhm.
To be Canadian, I don't think requires for you to give up aspects of your native culture that you
Mhm.
find valuable.
Mhm.
I
I
don't
like
think
that. Yeah.
anybody thinks that you cannot be Canadian if you really value eating Indian food, or
Yeah.
eat Indian food regularly, or espouse Indian values, right? That thing I really like. I think I take issue with the melting pot idea that many countries espouse of immigrant integration,
Yeah.
because by definition, a melting pot sort of requires you to give up aspects of yourself
Hmm.
to become part of a greater whole. I think I like the Canada idea of being more like a salad bowl. You can
Hmm.
all coexist, but be yourself. You don't have
Yeah.
to lose yourself to the whole, but you
Yeah.
can be yourself and contribute to a greater whole. I
Hmm.
like that. I like that
Yeah.
ethos that Canada has, and I hope we can hold on to that.
Yeah. I absolutely love that. That's a very amazing way to perspective to see things. Like actually, we're right. The melting point, melting pot. Saying melting pot is more like, hey, like you are kind of like giving away your percentage of yourself. But I like this being that salad and everybody's the individual ingredient and making this like a beautiful mix. So yeah, that's a great way to say it.
These are the things that I feel like I appreciate about Canada.
Hmm.
Another thing, although I don't think it's cultural, maybe it is,
Hmm.
Canadian media carries more immigrant stories by far and away. Immigrant
Hmm.
issues, immigrant stories, even policy issues and things like that than
Hmm.
American media.
Hmm. Okay.
And that's probably because the government prioritizes immigration. It's seen as a nation building activity. In the US, the positioning of immigration as an issue is very different.
Hmm.
So I've noticed that US media tends not to speak about skilled immigrant issues quite so eloquently. And it certainly doesn't share immigrant stories nearly as much. So, one of the first things I was exposed to in Canada was the CBC First Person series.
Yeah.
And that's how I got very interested in that series. And I loved reading it when I first came. It
Hmm.
made me feel so seen, so understood that, wow, there is space for these stories in just mainstream media, that
Yeah.
there's an appetite for this. That was very encouraging.
Yeah, I personally also loved your that story and that series as well. That's how I got to learn more about you and your journey. So speaking of that, that also further I believe led you to start your own newsletter. You call it This Immigrant Life, and you say that stories aren't just about giving people new information, it is also about making people seen at a time when their problems may make them feel utterly isolated. So tell us a little bit more about your newsletter and where can people find it?
I have my newsletter, This Immigrant Life, on Substack. Um, Through that, I share stories, and not just stories, a lot of information.
Yeah.
Increasingly, I've been writing about immigration to Canada because I see a gap in that space. There's not a lot of great information out there with regard to immigrating to Canada, and there's a fair bit of misunderstanding that coming to Canada is really easy and that PR is very straightforward. But I try always to weave in stories and experiences, mostly because I think whenever you're going through something, you tend to go inwards,
Hmm.
and that makes you feel isolated. Even if there are thousands of others going through exactly the same thing, you tend to find yourself, lonely in that
Hmm.
space. And I think when I was going through some of this stuff, it would have really helped me to read
Hmm.
stories about other people that were, say, not able to work,
Yeah.
that had hard won careers that they were not happy to let go of. And what were they doing? How did they have ideas on how to, deal with this?
Hmm.
What solutions did they come up with? It would have helped me to, hear some of that. Would I have followed all that advice? Maybe not.
Yeah.
But it helps not to feel like you're the only one under the weight of these rocks. That
Yeah.
was the idea behind both We the Legal, the
The
podcast that
podcast. Yeah.
tried to explain US immigration. The very short-lived podcast, I should add. Kudos to you for doing this. It Having done it firsthand, it's really hard, really difficult to put podcasts out consistently. And now, This Immigrant Life, which is the Substack newsletter.
Yeah. I just want to mention it to my listeners. I've shared it with you also, Sindhu. I have personally loved all your articles. They are, like I told you, they were like so fun and such like nicely you have thread things, the information and the personal anecdotes within it. That's what I think it makes them unique. And I highly encourage to all my listeners to definitely check that. And I'll put the link to that in the show notes.
Thank you. I so appreciate it. Like I said, hearing from another fellow creator or writer that your writing is something they resonated with is the best. It's right up there on the hierarchy of compliments.
So speaking of those articles, obviously there was this one that really particularly, caught my eye because that has been a regular chatter about it within media, on the internet, everywhere you see. whether to come to Canada or not. What is it Canada like? Is the right time to come, etc., etc. And there was this one article you wrote, which is called "The Immigrating to Canada: The Real Talk." And there were like a couple of points I think you mentioned, which would be important for somebody who is aspiring to come to Canada or is already in Canada, or somebody who just want to learn more about Canada. And I'd like to go like point by point. And the first point was know what you want before coming.
I think the main thing that one has to do when they're trying to immigrate is ask themselves why they're doing it. There are many reasons and many good reasons to
Hmm.
immigrate. You can immigrate to join your family. You can immigrate because you want to get great exposure in tech. You can immigrate to start a new business in a new geography. Or you can immigrate to earn well, get financial security, and go back home. But the thing is, one country will not satisfy all these requirements. You
Hmm.
need to know and pick your country based on your requirement.
Hmm.
If you want to work at the cutting edge of technology, Canada is probably not for you,
Hmm.
depending on the technology,
Yeah,
right? If you're looking for a cutting edge STEM career, Silicon Valley is probably the place for you.
absolutely.
But if you're looking for a place where the immigration system is going to give you a fair shot, at least a fair shot, and you're looking to settle somewhat long term, you do need to consider that. And maybe those are the people for whom Canada will work out.
Hmm.
That is the thing that I talk about with defining what is it that you want out of this immigrant experience. It's very important to start with that place. I just want to go is not a good place to start.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's like, like you also mentioned, you cannot assess if Canada is good fit for you if you don't know what you actually want. So that's for sure
Yeah.
keeping in mind. Yeah. Okay. And the second point was, speak to others like you.
Yeah, so I call this the future you sort of conversation, right? So I'm fairly active on places like LinkedIn,
Yeah.
and people will ask me whether there are enough project management jobs in Canada or whether there are enough IT jobs in Canada.
Hmm.
The only answer I can give to that is I don't know. I
Hmm.
work in medical device quality assurance, which is half a world away from project management or IT, right? I just
Yeah.
don't know. So, there are two things I would recommend people do. One is to look for data, right? And I have shared recently on LinkedIn some resources, and I will be writing a post on this soon to
Hmm.
find actual Government of Canada data on what sectors have labor shortages, what sectors are prevalent in what provinces, what sectors have experienced, dips in employment. All
Hmm.
of this data is available out there for free.
Yeah.
Look at that. So that's one. But data is not enough. Data doesn't tell a story. Data will not tell you how difficult it is to get your first job, right?
Hmm.
People will tell you that.
Yeah.
So, talk to somebody who is in your field, has immigrated, and found a job in your field relatively recently, right? Don't talk to somebody that came 15 years back. It was a very different situation back then. So, this
Absolutely.
is the part where I talk about like find a future you and talk to them. And people
Hmm.
on LinkedIn are very approachable. So,
Yeah.
definitely use that as a resource.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think I've covered this multiple times on the podcast that we do hesitate to reach out, but people are very, very helpful in Canada on LinkedIn. Just drop them a message. They'll
Absolutely.
definitely reach out to you. Yeah. And the next, obviously, the issues you said, know the big issues that might impact your life. And some of the issues you've mentioned is healthcare and housing.
I think people need to get away from this idea that if they search hard enough, they will find the perfect place for them.
Mhm.
It doesn't exist. The choices that you have is
Hmm.
to go to a country that has problems that you can work with, right?
Mhm.
So let's say you're the kind of person that is good at investing. You are not somebody that wants to buy a house and settle down. You're okay with renting just as
Mhm.
long as you're able to invest all that money and, you know, get a good return.
Yeah.
And that's the life you want to lead.
Hmm.
Canada is probably quite good for you because
Mhm.
housing is a problem. And maybe you have a remote job, so you don't need to live in, the urban core.
Yeah.
And Maybe that is workable for you.
Mm.
But if you're looking for a situation where you are trying to dodge problems, problems will eventually find you.
Yeah.
There is
Yeah.
no plan that will keep dodging problems.
Mm.
Good plans work with problems, they don't work around them. Right, like I
Mm.
said, the problem will eventually find you.
Yeah.
Now, healthcare and housing are the big problems in Canada. The third one we can probably add to this is credentialing. So, if you're in a job that requires getting a license or being licensed in Canada, it can take a long time to study and get that license, and it can involve considerable expenditure. So, that's
Mhm.
something to consider too. Understand the issues of the country that you're going to by talking to people, by reading up about them,
Hmm.
so that you don't get overwhelmed with them. Right, every country has issues. There's no such thing as a perfect country, but at least you'll know what they are. Isn't it better to find out that your career takes 2 years of credentialing before you move somewhere,
Yeah.
right, rather than find out 6 months after you got there? I think that's important to go clear eyed.
Yeah. Wow, you mentioned like a couple of things here, but I'll just highlight two. One you I loved. You said the perfect place doesn't exist. And second, you said the good plans work well even around the problems. So I love these both. And the another one, obviously, we discussed briefly as well earlier, the corporate vacation structure, which assume there are families here. They don't know that sometimes you have to travel halfway around the world, and 2 weeks are just not enough for an immigrant sometimes. And I think you were very passionate about the same topic as well. So please talk a little bit more about that.
I think gradually, countries in the West that take in a lot of immigrants will have to understand that their love of immigration is not the same as actually having accommodation for immigrants.
Hmm.
We haven't gotten there yet. So, an example of this is the corporate vacation structure. When you have people whose families are in the same country and they can visit them for, say, Christmas and Thanksgiving
Yeah.
and things like that, that's one thing. But to benefit from people who are coming from across the world, bringing their skills and experience and all that, but to somehow just not consider those elements in your policies, both at the country level, at the company level, at all levels, is just not okay.
Yeah.
I think past a point. A great example of this in the US, for example, is um, when people lose their jobs, when they're laid off, they're given nice severance packages
Hmm.
in big companies, and they're usually fairly generous. But frankly, what an employee on a visa needs is not money. Usually, what they need is time,
Hmm.
because in 60 days, they will need to find a job and put in their visa paperwork.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, they're out. The fact that very few companies offer to keep their employees on the payroll instead of just giving them a severance packet and getting them out the door
Mhm.
is frankly surprising given
Hmm.
the number of immigrants that work in the US. Even this level of consideration in corporate policy making has not started yet on a
Hmm.
widespread basis. This is the sort of thing I talk about when I say that a lot of these countries seem to accept immigration. They seem to love diversity. They seem to love all these ideas, but that is not translated into accommodation for the immigrants themselves.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. This is such a solid point and something which I think we as immigrants have been discussing, even within my groups, friends groups. We all discuss about the same thing that 2 weeks are just not enough. And some sort of policy, I hope so. At least the conversation starts in the coming year, at least initiates such sort of conversation and it actually reflects in the decision and the policies that they end up making. Yeah, hopefully.
I hope so. Some companies are starting to do undefined
Mhm.
vacations, right? Like they're open ended, for
Unlimited
example.
ones. Yes. Yeah.
And of course, unlimited is theoretical, right? Obviously, there's some
Yeah.
idea of appropriate vacation, but I hope there's some flexibility there for people who have senior care obligations in
Hmm.
other countries, for example.
Hmm.
So their parents live there. They don't just go there to visit. They also have senior care obligations in another country.
Hmm.
That doesn't just go away, right? That's a
Yeah.
part of life.
Okay, Sindhu, now before we get into the final segment, I have included this new segment this season. I called it Know Your Host, where I give my guests an opportunity to ask me any questions you might have. So go for it.
Oh, I love that. I want to know what you think makes a
Mhm.
good podcast guest for your podcast specifically.
One thing I have said since I started this podcast that for me, there is no perfect guest and there is like no perfect story. I feel like every story is unique to themselves and there is always something or the other thing that you can learn from everybody. I remember in the beginning of my journey, fortunately, some people who reached out to me wanted to be part of the podcast and come there as a guest. They have asked me that uh, we hope that you consider us. And I've told them, they said, we don't know if there's something extraordinary about my story that you'd like to highlight. And I've told them the same thing. Every story is extraordinary in their own way. And I am nobody to define that your story is perfect or you are a perfect guest for me. No. Because, for example, if you have a certain lesson or you have like a certain experience, maybe it might not be beneficial to me or it might not relate with me, but I'm sure there is somebody, the people, I'm saying millions, let's just say, I'm manifesting that the millions of people who are listening to this podcast, there might be like one person who might resonate with that and might learn from it. So I think short answer to your question is, for me, no, every story is unique in it themselves and there is no perfect answer to it.
You know, when you reached out to me, I was very curious about how you got to create this podcast. Every
Mhm.
podcast has a story, right? There's a reason people
Mm.
do this
Yeah.
much work to put out
Yeah.
these kinds of stories. What was the story behind my thick accent?
Well, one thing which I have mentioned a couple of times on the podcast also, I was working in this market research company and I was interviewing somebody over the phone. And this man in between the conversation said that, "Oh my God, you have such a thick Indian accent." And to which I replied, "Sir, you also have a thick Canadian accent." So for some reason, that just, yeah, I
I
said that
love
to him
that.
because that's what we have. It was just one of those days. I'm not in my element, I'm just tired, I'm hungry. And when he said that to me, I said, "Sir, you also have a thick Canadian accent." And he just giggled just like you and he hung up. So for some reason that name just stayed with me. Not that I wanted to start a podcast, but a few months after that, I was started speaking to people on the phone who were international students. We were basically interviewing people on behalf of the Ontario's Ministry of Education, the people
Mhm.
who have recently graduated. We were speaking to them, and everybody, Sindhu, I think everybody I was speaking to, I would say 90% of them was at least cribbing about their program and not being able to find a job. And I was actually in the similar situation at that time. That's why I was doing that call center job, because I had nothing else to do and I was not getting any response from anybody. So at one point I was like, okay, these guys need help. And so do I. So I was like, instead of like me reinventing the wheel, let me just collaborate with this incredible people, just like yourself, who are ready to lend a helping hand to individuals. And like you said, reach out to people or talk to your future self. Exactly. I also wanted at some point somebody like me who would have these conversations, have this kind of podcast from which I can learn, because there was nothing like this when I came to Canada 5 years ago. So maybe I'm creating this for my past gurus, somebody, the future, the new people who are coming to Canada. I am just want to lend a helping hand if they can listen to these stories and feel that, hey, we are not alone into this. If your experience is not validated, you are not alone. If you're not getting a response from anybody, you are not alone. And if they question your identity, or if they question your accent, or if they question that why is English so good, you are not alone. We all have been through that. And if he or she can really dodge that and tackle that and have that blinders towards all these discrimination and hate comments, you can too. So that's why my whole purpose is to tell people that, hey, if he or she can do it, you can do it as well. All in all, it just takes a little bit of time, a little bit of consistency and patience, for sure. Yeah.
Amazing. I really like that rebuttal that you had the presence of mind to give. I think a lot of people, when they hear that, they feel so defensive.
Yeah.
They suddenly become very, they seize up, they feel like they're not putting their best foot forward, and it
Yeah.
can make you very defensive. And
Yeah.
one of the interesting things that I've seen, I don't know if you've noticed this, and I'd be curious to see what your experience has been. For us, people in our generation growing up, when we were told that we didn't speak great English, or something like that, we were
Hmm.
defensive. But
Hmm.
I think the generation now is not like that. They're a lot
Hmm.
more, no, no, we're not going to hear that from you. And by you,
Hmm.
they're not um, as
Receptive.
worshipping of the West as we, I think, were. We looked at them with so much awe, not worshipping, but awe.
Hmm.
And now it's not like that as much anymore. There's more self confidence in that generation of today than we had at their age.
Yeah, I think one reason of that could also be the exposure and the right examples, because back then we would have like limited examples that we see on the television, for example, maybe in the films and movies. But I think now, because of social media, you find a lot of familiar people, and a lot of like familiar people with like familiar thoughts and identity, so to say, and you relate to that a little bit of more, and you feel that, okay, I'm not alone into this, and there's nothing wrong with me if I speak this way, or I dress this way, or I act this way. There's nothing wrong with me. So I think that's why they have more confidence in themselves, I would say. Maybe
So
that could be the reason. Yeah.
yeah, it's a very interesting point. I do notice this when I travel back home these days, that yeah, their attitude towards um, speaking English, or their personal
Mhm.
confidence has increased, which
Yeah,
is interesting.
absolutely. Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
very
any
enjoyable. Thank you.
any other question you have?
Uh, I have lots of questions. You shouldn't do this to me. I will ask you lots of questions.
Okay, just one more is allowed.
Just one more. What has been your experience living in Montreal?
I think,
The
go ahead.
immigrant experience living in Montreal specifically.
Okay. Well, definitely, I think initially it was hard because everything is in French. But the good thing is people within the city are pretty much bilingual. It's just that to access certain governmental institutions, it's very hard to go through the system, because usually it's in French, and also because of the new policies that they are coming up, that has made things a little bit hard. But I would say by now, since it's been like 5 6 years, I have got used to certain things. For example, I know the restaurants I'm gonna go to, because even the menus are in French, right? Most of them. I know that what I want, I have my go-to order and everything. But as an immigrant, I would say yes, definitely you have like less familiar faces, like comparing it to Canada, to Toronto. Like for example, I recently visited Toronto, and I had this one experience, and somebody was asking me that, how are you feeling in Toronto? And I told them there is some sort of warmth within the city, and that's solely because of the presence of our community, and by that I mean the Indian Punjabi community as well, particularly. And just being having that ability to go to these certain networking events and interacting with these people, I really feel, I wish I would have had that maybe 4 years ago. Or I wish the people who are currently in Montreal, international students in Montreal, they would have had that. That is something that was missing throughout my 5 6 years, Sindhu. And because of that, I have not been able to have enough Indian friends also. I just connected more with my local people, or the another immigrants who just immigrated to Montreal. So yeah, I would say, but all in all, it's been a learning experience. I am actually glad also I came to this part of Canada, because this city is beautiful. There's a lot of diversity in its own self, which also kind of gives you a different perspective of things which you might not see in Toronto, I would say. So yeah, all in all, I would say it's a very enriching experience. Yeah.
Fascinating. Fascinating. I really am very interested in learning about the experience of people who came to Canada and you know s- settled only here,
Mhm.
because a lot of the people that I know were in the US. And people in the
Mhm.
US talk a lot about their immigrant experience because of everything
Mhm.
that they go through. In fact, there's this trajectory. Every party, it goes exactly the same. You meet,
Mhm.
you talk about not immigration related topics to distract yourself.
Mhm.
Then you
Yeah.
eat, and then you talk about how your visa situation is going, and then it goes
Yeah.
downhill from there. Then it it ends up in how it all sucks. That's the
Yeah.
trajectory of every immigrant gathering in the US. If you've been there for more than about 6 to 8 years, there's a
Mhm.
flow, right? But
Mhm.
here in Canada, I find that's not as much the case. I think up until now, at least, the PR journey has not been terrible.
Mhm.
It's getting harder, of course, but yeah, it's certainly different.
Now, Sindhu, we are in the final segment of the podcast. I call it Beneath the Accent because we are knowing each other beneath the accent. I'm going to ask a couple of questions. You can answer them in one word or a sentence or however you feel like. The idea is just to know more about you. So, ready?
Mhm.
So, first, the classic question: what advice would you give to Sindhu, who is in the initial months of landing in Canada?
It is going to take longer than you think to find your feet here, but it's okay. You'll be fine.
Okay. And what advice would you give to your younger self and at what age?
Nothing. I think it's fine. Young people should just do their thing.
I like that. Okay. Describe a moment when you experienced a significant cultural difference that surprised you, whether in the US or in Canada.
I think I was surprised at how bad Canadians are at salesmanship
Okay.
compared to the Americans.
Oh, okay.
Really terrible in a funny way.
Okay. Do you have any instance to share?
Yeah, like for example, the Canadian banking industry, they act like
Mm.
your mom. Like you can't have a credit card more than
Oh.
$5,000 when you arrive because what if you can't pay it? In the US, it's like,
Mm.
here, go. And if you can't pay it, we'll catch you with 23% interest later. I mean, it's a much more risk
Okay.
taking economy in the US compared to
Mm.
Canada. Canada is very conservative and careful, and
Mm.
there's a lot of guardrails, right? The US is
Mm.
a lot freer.
Okay. Very
Yeah,
interesting. Okay.
yeah.
What's this one dish from your home country that always brings you comfort and nostalgia?
Dosas,
Hmm.
homemade.
Okay. Do you have any funny story related to misunderstanding around the accent or the English?
Yeah, so I once had a question about my taxes in the US,
Mhm.
and I called the IRS hotline for it. And this person on the other side had this strange accent. I can't even place what accent that was.
Mhm.
And I was baffled that they would choose somebody with an unintelligible accent to talk about a topic that is difficult to understand even in the most,
That's good.
understandable accent. And after I think he couldn't understand what I was saying either. After going a
Okay.
little bit back and forth, we just hung up. Like, okay, this is not working. So,
Oh wow,
yeah, it was
that is
very funny.
funny. Okay. What's your favorite cultural festival or celebration in Canada? And how do you usually celebrate it?
Do you mean a Canadian event?
Exactly.
Honestly, I haven't partaken in a lot of Canadian events yet. I want to,
Okay.
uh, but I've
Mm.
not actually had the chance. The thing I want to do is go to Ottawa on the
Hmm.
1st of July on Canada Day.
Okay.
I've heard it's
Yeah.
very interesting and lively, so I do want to
Hmm.
do that.
Mm. Okay. Interesting. Another festival I've always heard about people talking is on the podcast is Thanksgiving. They said that is something that they have adopted and they have really celebrated in their family.
Ah, how nice. That's a good
Yeah.
idea.
Share a quick tip for fellow immigrants trying to adjust in a new country.
Really open up. You chose to come here because you wanted exposure, you wanted to be in a country that is not your own. embrace it. If you wanted to live exactly like how you lived there, you could have done it there for much lower
Mm,
rent and,
absolutely.
with a lot of help, raising your children and doing your dishes and your clothes and everything. So please embrace life beyond just what you would have lived in your country.
Yeah, definitely, definitely the best advice. Okay. Tell us about your first friend that you made in Canada and how did you meet them?
This is an interesting story. So I met them through a meetup,
Hmm.
and they have a very retiring personality. He's very self-conscious, very quiet, but when you talk to them, they really open up once they know you. And then we decided together, both of us enjoy writing, so we joined another meetup, which was a writers kind of collective. You get
Okay.
together on certain nights of the week and write.
Hmm.
um, and gradually I got to know them well, and it was incredible that through a meetup you could have a relationship that is actually
Yeah.
meaningful and interesting and deep. So that was my
Yeah.
first real friendship in Canada.
Share a moment when being an immigrant made you feel exceptionally proud or accomplished.
I think there was this colleague that I had, and this was at a time where immigration was difficult. I was still working. In fact, the worst was yet to come, but I didn't know at that time. And she was quite close to me, so I used to share a lot with her. And she once said, "You should really write a book about all these experiences."
Hmm.
And I said, "Oh my God, you don't know how common this is. There's nothing remotely remarkable about what I'm telling you. It's just that maybe nobody else has told you this. This is so common." And she said, "Well, not to me and not to so many Americans. I don't think you realize how exceptional it is what you folks go through and how you persevere through it." And in that moment, I think I looked at everything that we experience through American eyes and through native eyes. And I was really proud in that moment, for the journey that so many of us undertake. And we normalize it to an extent that we find it utterly unremarkable, but it is remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. Indeed, it is. And that's why this podcast exists to celebrate these stories. Yeah.
Totally. It's we should remind ourselves to celebrate it once in a while.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Is there something that you ate for the first time in Canada?
Poutine, and I did not like it.
You're not the only one. Many people say that.
I think it's just, yeah, maybe it's not for me.
Hmm, okay. If you had to describe yourself as any animal or any creature, what would it be and why?
Oh, definitely a dog. I have 100% dog personality, I think.
Hmm. Okay.
I think I'm very attuned to the people that are immediately around me. It impacts me a lot if they're not doing well.
Mhm.
And yeah, very much a dog personality.
Okay. If you could have any superpower, what would it be?
Wow, that's a great question. I haven't thought about it. There are so many low hanging fruit just everywhere across the world in um, government policy. This has to
Hmm.
be the most boring answer any of your guests have given you. I realize that. I would fix those. Just really low hanging fruit that would make so many lives better.
Well, it might be boring, but it would be very, very beneficial.
Yes,
So please go for it.
yes, let's do it.
If you had to create this one law that everybody has to follow, what would it be?
Just not getting too offended by everything all the time. You
Hmm.
have got to understand and give space for other people to express themselves. There is a loss when people
Hmm.
are thinking too hard about what they're saying. Not online, I'm not suggesting that everybody should just say hateful, terrible things, but there are certain niche ideas that may sound wacky, but I think they should be expressed, because a lot of
Hmm.
ideas before their time sound just bananas. But
Hmm.
there should still be room for it to be expressed.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I love that. So describe Canada in one word or a sentence.
Resisting definition.
Hmm.
I love that
Okay.
about Canada. I love that it is so hard to define what it is to be a Canadian and
Hmm.
what is Canada like culturally. It's so fuzzy. And that fuzziness, I think, is what makes it uniquely inclusive.
Wow, I love that. It's amazing how every time I get such a mind boggling answer every time. Because this is, if you really think about it, it's true what you said. It's so true. And somebody who said on the podcast that it's like a quilt with different patches on it, and each patch defines a certain culture that they bring along with it. That's also mind boggling in its own way. So I'm just always amazed how guests come up with their own eye, with their own, whatever they have witnessed throughout their journey and how they define it. So I love that.
It's
Thank
a
you for that.
very nice question. It's a very
Yeah.
nice question. I'm sure a lot of
Mm.
thought went into it. It's a very nice question.
So finally, if you could leave me with one piece of advice, what would it be?
I think you put so much thought into the structure of your podcast and everything. Um, Honestly, I was really surprised at how much background work you've done reading through the Substack and the article and everything. Honestly, I can't think of anything. The only thing that I would say to anybody hosting a podcast is to make it as free flowing as possible while still
Mhm.
following a structure. It's very tricky to
Yeah.
do, right?
Hmm.
Where digressions are your friend. Embrace
Hmm.
digressions. That's where
Absolutely.
the real conversation is.
Hmm. Okay. Perfect. Thank you for your kind words. So, and finally, how would you describe your experience of being on the podcast?
When we first spoke, just to get to know one another, I really
Yeah.
enjoyed the perspective that you shared of why you wanted these stories to be told,
Hmm.
and just the idea that you wanted a diversity of voices. I saw a lot of overlap between the way we thought about these things, and
Hmm.
the podcast has totally over delivered on that. I really enjoyed it. The fun elements are really enjoyable, so great idea with doing that in season 2, and I'm very fortunate
Hmm.
to have been part of this season. Really
Yeah.
enjoyed the fun parts, for sure.
Perfect. Awesome. Very glad to hear that. So, on that note, thank you. Thank you, Sindhu, for being on the podcast and adding value to my listeners. Thank you.
Thank you.